Welcome back, everyone. We are back in the mix. I have a special guest today. I have the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. DeathDonkey. Mr. DeathDonkey, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me to review some hands.
Mr. Kyle, I'm happy to be here. Yeah, reviewing hands, that's kind of what I do, so I'm happy to be a part of it with you.
I feel like your voice is so well known now. It's just echoing so well. But yeah, we're gonna do going forward here. We're gonna try to do a 5 hand review where we just discuss some like basic strategy for everyone who's like learning the games. And I know I kind of talk basically when I'm playing, but at the same time too, if we can just do a little bit more in depth with Chris, I think there's probably no better person to go over some of these hands with. So I'm super excited to have him. Again, if anyone just wants to say hi to Chris or follow him, he's got his YouTube page now. He's doing a lot of GTO stuff. It's at DeathDonkey on YouTube, and then you are still at DeathDonkey on Twitter/X. Am I correct?
I am. That is right. Yeah, I just recently started doing some YouTube content. I'm starting out focusing on some GTO concepts for Limit Hold'em, but hopefully in the future expand it to some of the other mixed game stuff when I can get some better, some better tools up there to discuss things. But today it looks like we've got some triple draw hands, huh?
Yeah, I figured this is a good one to start with you. You're kind of the go-to guy, all the way back from Deuces Cracked. And yeah, let's start off with some basic triple draw here. So
Okay.
we have 5 hands we're gonna go through. Put some text over there for you. So hand one here, we got I play this one, and I'm curious if we should semi-bluff this one with blockers. So obviously we start with a really strong draw with the 5-4-3-2 4-handed game. So we open, cleared.
Yeah, I know you're throwing away a 6, which is like also just something you should keep in mind when you're learning this game is think about the cards that you're throwing away and if they're kind of relevant. That affects your strategy on later streets.
Yeah, definitely. And this is going to come into play for me too here later on. As you'll see, like obviously I've thrown a 6 away, I catch a 3. I bet I get pretty quickly check raised, and he quick pats basically, and now I catch a deuce. So
Yeah.
like I guess one of the questions I want to specifically ask you, because obviously this is a I would say like a psychological session for me, is I get to ask you questions, which is always fun. Is when I have the 6, the 3, and now I catch an extra deuce, like should I be going, like is this the good spot to consider like semi bluffing my hand, or like trying to get my opponent to fold or break or do something like that? Because like I don't have a made hand at this point. Like I have a lot of pairs, but even if he breaks, I'm still drawing one in position.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of the awkward thing about this exact hand, right? Like it is tempting because you've seen some key cards, and I would also just note that Villain's range should be like pretty weak here, right? I mean, he was in the big blind drawing 2 and then Pat, and he can have all sorts of really, really rough hands. I think that there's some merit in raising here, and the idea behind it would just be that you're really hoping to get an immediate fold. I mean, you're kind of representing that you're going to have a Pat hand if you raise the turn here, and so if he has a hand like a 9-8 low or something like that, I mean, he should at least consider throwing it away. There's no, there's really nowhere to go with a hand like that. So it's tempting. I think you have good blockers, but not exactly the right kind of a hand for it.
What would be the right kind of hand for us to consider doing it?
Well, I would like it more if you had a worse draw in a way, because now you've got pair blockers, but you don't have this wheel draw with it. So like, imagine you opened in the cutoff with a hand like 3-4-6-7, and then you paired a 6 and then a 3 or started with an extra pair, and then you caught a 3 and maybe say another 3 right here, right? I think that would be like the ideal candidate, because the draw itself is not particularly exciting. So you feel comfortable even if he calls your raise on the turn and pats, you can still go for it. You can stand pat behind him and fire off the last barrel. I do think that there's kind of a psychological thing that happens in triple draw with your opponent. Like when you're out of position and you get raised on the turn, a lot of times you kind of hate your hand, but you're like, well, maybe he's bluffing me, so I'm going to continue. And then if he stands pat behind me, then I know he's not bluffing. He's really got a good hand. And then when he bets the river, I'm going to make the discipline fold and save the bet, right? Because he'd have to be crazy to try to bluff the off of it at this point. So I do think sometimes it requires firing the last barrel more so than just going for it right here on the turn.
Yeah, right. Okay, that makes sense. All right, let's play the rest of this one. I don't remember what I do here, but I think I go for the raise.
Yeah, I don't really hate it.
Yeah, and I don't think this is on like triple speed. I'm just checking here real quick. No, this is normal. Like the actions here are just going super fast. So he snap pats. I make a jack on the river. And what's kind of interesting here is he check called and then he decides to value bet the river.
It is.
Yeah, I don't think like this is a bluff per se, but I don't think I'm paying this one off. I think it's
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And I would just throw this out there for your audience that like his play is not particularly good here. I mean, this usually says to me he has a better hand than you think, and he's like, wow, I haven't put enough money in with this hand yet, but that hand should have probably just kind of like grit its teeth and 3-bet the turn.
Yeah, right.
Like you don't really want to get 4-bet, but if you have like quite a good hand here, you kind of have to get your value on the turn.
Yeah.
If you play it in this way, even if your hand is relatively strong on the river, you should just check, because at this point the guy in position is drawing, and it's very likely that you have a premium draw like you do. I mean, there's some problems with your draw we could discuss more in detail, but it's not a bad draw. And on the end, you're often going to make a hand that can't really call a bet or is good enough to bet itself. So there's really not a ton of incentive for the out of position player to reopen the action here.
Yeah, and I also think too at the same time, like I don't think my opponent is ever taking a bluff line this way. So I once I get here, like even if I make a I would say a good block catching hand, like I'm probably not paying it off.
You kind of did, right? I mean, in a way, you have a hand that can catch a bluff now for sure, but it doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense, I think, for you to call. So yeah. All right, and I think I'm pretty sure I just let this one go. I was like, I kind of thought about it for a second, like how can he bet here? But I think I had him full.
Yeah, he just has like somewhere between number 4 and number 10, and he's just like, well, maybe I should just put another bet in.
Yep. Okay. All right, that was hand 1. Let's see hand 2. Where'd my text go? There's their hand 2. All right, hand 2, 97642 after the second draw.
Some complicated spots. You found some close ones, I would say.
Yeah, this is I remember this one. This one's kind of a fun one. So cut off here opens 4-handed. Button calls.
All right, so we multi-way and we throw away a jack and a 10.
Yep.
Remember, always just be thinking about those blockers. Kind of say them to yourself when you're playing.
Yeah. Like I think I got this is a good concept, because like you always used to tell me about like how you were very good at keeping track of the stud cards when they're gone, and so I should definitely have the responsibility of being able to remember 4 in my hand.
For sure, it becomes second nature to just like kind of be thinking about your cards, right? And so now we've also seen one pair blocker, but nothing's super exciting at this point. The flop checked around 3 ways, so nobody's really loving their hand.
Yeah, flop checked around 3 ways. No one's really loving their hand, and it goes. It went from 2-3-2 to 2-2-2, and now we make this 2-4-6-7-9.
Okay.
So, like
immediately a complicated spot, right?
For sure, absolutely. Like part of me wants to say like, oh, I have a 9 here against a 2-2, like a 2-2-2. I feel like I'm a pretty substantial favorite equity wise here when I make this hand against their ranges. And I'm at the same time, I'm like, well, I'm out of position. I have a, a smooth 7 draw 2 here. So I guess we'll just kind of see how this hand develops.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to maybe pause here for a second. Let's just talk about this situation a little bit.
Sure.
You threw away a jack and a 10, which are fairly relevant in this spot now, right? I mean, when you think about drawing 2 on the turn, the sort of hands that your opponents could make that might be tempted to play as a pat would be a 10 low or a jack low. It wouldn't surprise me at all if one of your opponents made like a 10 low and raised here on the turn, for example. So I guess my first question to you would be like, if you're going to lead this spot, what's your plan if you get raised by one of your opponents?
It's a really good question. I think in game I thought about this and I'm like, well, if I just decide to get raised, it's really close. Like I feel like I'm going to probably bite my teeth and pat the 9-7 because it's probably a little bit too strong in a 2-2 spot. I hate giving up the smooth 7 draw, but I feel like what you're saying is like my opponents I feel like are going to try to reach sometimes to get me to break this type of hand or just get it isolated with even like a 1.
Possible.
Like I think it's possible like Spectre here, and I haven't played a lot with that player at all, but I think too like if they improved a 1-card draw, a lot of the lower stakes players still like, oh, I improved a 1-card draw, I'm going to try to raise to get this pot heads up with CT, and obviously that break out of position here and don't keep the 9. It's kind of a small catastrophe. So I'm probably going to bite my teeth and pat my hand.
Okay, so I somewhat agree with what you're saying, but I think there's some other things to consider, right? So, I mean, 1, the jack and the 10 are working against you here. I think it makes me want to break your hand more, having seen a jack and the 10 earlier in the hand. It makes villain a little bit more likely to have a better hand than yours or a hand that probably won't raise, right? I think when you see a jack and a 10, those are the cards that your opponent might raise with that you beat. I mean, of course, if he's raising one card draws, then breaking's kind of a disaster, like you said. But I don't think that's as common. Another factor to consider here is that this pot is relatively small, right? I mean, when you're playing a limit poker game, you always want to think about how the size of the pot impacts your strategy. And like in this situation, it could not really be any smaller. It was single raised 3 ways, and then the flop checked around. So there's been no excess action. When that's the case, you want to think a little bit more about implied odds and a little less about your hot and cold equity. As the pot grows, we sort of want to latch onto our equity and not make a mistake of breaking the best hand, right? Like the bigger the pot, the more it's a disaster to break the winning hand. Does that make sense?
Yep, totally makes sense. Yep.
So that both those factors would lead me towards maybe breaking this hand a little bit more. But I think there's another thing that we haven't talked about yet, which is probably the most important thing, which is that when you're in a 3-way spot and you're first to act and it goes 2-2-2, I believe you want to play really defensively here. This is a situation where by being out of position to 2 other players, you're just at an information disadvantage. You're going to have a hard time making decisions here. I really like checking this hand on the turn. I think a lot of good things can happen when you check this hand on the turn. One, you might just face action that allows you to break the hand more readily, right? Like, for example, if you check and it goes bet, call, I prefer calling and drawing multi-way. I don't really want to play the 9-7 out of position 3 ways on the river. I think your draw has tremendously good positive implied odds. And it would just be a close decision either way, but that would be enough to sway me. And then the other factor I would say is that it might check to the button who's going to bet like pretty wide. You know, imagine you're the button here and it checks to you and you pick up like a 4-card draw. I mean, you have a lot of incentive to bet. Maybe your opponents don't look particularly strong. Maybe you just win the pot right there. Now you get to check raise. You get to protect your hand, push the other guy out, and you face a weaker range. So I think that there's a lot of nice things that can happen if you check the spot.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we get to a lot of the other hands that I've played as of recently, because I feel like I've done a lot of I tend to go a lot for the check raise line when I go to like 2 to pat a lot in like even like 2-2 spots. So, and I felt like I was missing a little bit of value. And so in this situation, I decided to bet my hand. But every single thing that you just said, I think actually kind of comes to fruition going forward.
Just remember that the more multi-way that you are, the more the first to act guy gets punished. So you need to just be more defensive minded in general. In a heads-up situation, it's less important.
Right. I actually think when I first made this hand, I think I remember specifically like, man, I think I really just want to check in a 2-2-2 spot. But I'm like, I kind of have something here, so I'm decided, like I'll just bet and like figure it out later, which isn't necessarily.
The problem is you're not going to get a lot of good information. It's going to be a little hard to figure out what's the best plan.
For sure. You make a really good point there. So we'll just play this the next part out. So we bet. I believe it's going to go call here.
Okay. Well, then I guess I pat, but I don't really love it, right?
Yeah, right. And
exactly. Yeah, standard probably.
Yeah. So I pat. I was like,
it likely goes 1-1.
Exactly.
Your opponent's going to fold their draw twos on the turn of the spot.
Yep.
And I guess now it's kind of a no-brainer check. Your hand's not good enough to value bet. You're not really bluffing.
Yeah. I check. Now CT bets in position here. I will say, I'm going to let you speak this one out, and then I'll clear this one. Oh, actually, I'll let you speak to this one here in this situation, because like, I'm not quite sure if this is the. I was going to say, I'm not quite sure if like what my range technically looks like when I decide to lead, because obviously I think, I should be doing a lot of checking, because when I decide to lead, like I'm probably removing like a lot of 7s from my range. Like I think I'm going for tech raises a lot. Maybe even like.
So you just don't have a 7 that often when you draw 2, right? It's just hard. It's really hard to have.
Super hard. So removing a lot of my, like the best hands, I would say, from my range in this situation.
Right. So I guess one thing I would think about in a small stakes game is, well, okay, so whenever you're facing a bet on the river, the first place to start is, can you beat any value? And in my opinion, the answer here is no, unless you're against people that really don't understand basics of the game, right? Like if you're playing against someone who just fundamentally doesn't understand the game, then you probably need to call, because maybe they just made a 9-8 or a 10 and they don't really know what's good and they bet for value, right? Now you just have to call. But against anyone like remotely competent, I don't really think your hand can beat any value. So now the question is like, do I want to go with like an exploit mindset, or do I want to go with like a GTO mindset, right? And what you're describing about like, what does your range look like and how often can you really have a better hand than this is the GTO mindset, which is important and is a good starting place. And it does strike me that your hand is maybe a reasonable calling hand, based on all those factors. I would argue that people tend to underbluff in most limit spots, particularly in multi-way pots. And if I was going to go with an exploitative mindset, I would push me more towards folding, with combos like this one, where I just expect to catch less bluffs than normal. And there's another small factor which is really working against you, which is you're not closing the action. And there's a little bit of a chance that the middle guy has checked a mediocre hand that, like, he just didn't feel comfortable value betting, like, in, let's say, an 8-7 or something. And if you ever call this spot and then he overcalls, a complete disaster has happened. You've thrown away an entire big bet because there's literally zero chance you could ever beat both of them.
Yeah, right. 100%. Yeah.
And at the same time, it's also a little bit hard for this guy CT to bluff in this spot, knowing he has to get through two opponents. So all in all, I think your hand is a borderline call in GTO land. And from an exploit point of view, I feel fine folding.
Okay. So in game, I do end up folding this hand and then think about it for a little bit and fold. But I have seen, at this point, I had not seen really CT do a lot of bluffing. So I was like, oh, I feel like this is an exploitative play by folding in this situation, like exactly what you said. But in the last couple times since I've made this video, I feel like I've seen like way too many overbluffs from him. So
Yeah.
he might actually be the one that like could actually theoretically have the bluff here three-way. So just wanted to point that out. But yeah, I think the analysis is really spot on again. All right.
Yeah, those 9-7s are very difficult to play, particularly out of position multi-way.
Yeah, and they feel so brutal keeping the 9-7 when you have a smooth draw too.
Right.
Like you just want to just make a hand, but yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the idea is that when you have such a premium draw underneath it, you are thinking about how the river is going to play. And that's kind of a good concept in limit poker, particularly in the smaller pots, right? You want to be thinking about how the river is going to play. If you're going to always check the river and then basically be miserable if you ever face a bet, then, that's that's a reverse implied odds situation where you're basically going to have a crappy decision no matter what you do. However, if you can draw to a hand that can bet and raise the river, then that's a plus implied odds situation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, great point. All right, hand 3 here. I believe this is 2 hands later, so I think this comes into play a little bit. So,
all right, exciting round to triple draw here.
Yeah, the triple draw's a fun game.
Okay, so I always try to take note of if I have a 9 in my hand, that is going to affect your thoughts a little bit in the hand,
Yep.
So you did throw away a 9,
So
and you make a premium draw right away in a 3-3 situation.
3-3 situation and a block of deuce.
Huge, yeah.
Yep. So, bet.
2-1, and you make the 8-7.
Make the 8-7 perfect.
And I assume you get check raise because you asked about freeze.
Yep. And we get checkmates in the situation. So we've seen.
Okay.
Yep, we've seen a 9. We've seen a deuce, and now we make this hand in position. And now for me, my first inclination here is to want to just 3-bet. Like this feels like such a strong hand against a check raise.
Yep.
But at the same time too, I'm like, is it strong enough that I want to 3-bet this hand, or do I just want to have my opponent pat dead?
Right.
Because like usually situation, if I freeze behind, if I call and I freeze behind him, he's dead.
Yeah.
So that's
okay, so
go ahead.
So what I was going to say about that is that it is an overrated concept to try to make your opponent make a padding mistake so that you can lock up the equity in the pot versus make more money with bets, right? Like the idea that you're balancing between is, well, if my opponent pats and I pat behind and have him beat, then he doesn't have the opportunity to break and never can outdraw me. But maybe you win less bets, right? Fewer bets. I think that is something that people extend too far. Typically, they do not go for value enough because they're more concerned about locking up their equity rather than getting the money in, to make more money. So I do think that is a bit of an overblown concept. I also think that your hand is at least a little bit close, but the reason I do lean towards 3-bet is because I think that the line that your opponent is taking here is one that is often misplayed by small stakes opponents. When it goes 2-1 on the turn, they just don't feel comfortable check, call, pat with some hands. Like when they make some sort of a 9 here, they feel obligated to check raise, and that is definitely not a good play. They don't necessarily need to do that very often. When you're in a 2-1 situation, you need to be very passive and defensive minded. You're at a pretty big range disadvantage. So
Right.
I would expect a good player to play a lot of check calls that stand pat here, but I would expect an inexperienced player to check raise too often. And obviously, if they're check raising too many weak hands, then your hand is doing even better against that.
Right. 100%. And again, like my read at the time again was I had not seen my opponent bluff like almost ever in this situation, so
Sure.
I felt that his range was a lot tighter. And given that fact, I'll play this one going forward here. If you want me to sub, do you have anything else that you want to add to it, or is that pretty good?
Well, I would just add one more thing, which is that you have an interesting candidate hand in general, which is that another good reason to 3-bet this hand is that I actually think it's relatively easy to play after that. Let's say, for example, you 3-bet and your opponent calls and stands pat. Well, obviously, I think your hand is strong enough to stand pat behind him and bet the river for value. However, if your opponent 4-bets, I think your hand is attempting one to break and draw to the wheel. Now, I rarely break an 8 in limit triple draw,
Same, yeah.
but you have the hand. You know what I mean? You have the hand where you have to remember how quickly the ranges shrink up when multiple big bets start going in on the turn. Like for your opponent to check raise, that can mean a whole bunch of hands. But for him to 4-bet out of position, which basically implies that he's going to be willing to bet the river as well. So he's basically saying, I'm willing to put in 5 big bets with this hand. Your 8-7-4 has shrunk up massively, and you do have this nice premium wheel draw sitting there staring you in the face. So I rarely 3-bet for quote-unquote information, but I don't mind 3-betting a situation where if I feel like your hand has clear routes to proceed.
Sure. There's 2 things I want to add. The first thing I want to say is I thank you. I actually have not mentioned that specific concept on the channel. Is like when you start putting in, like when it goes like raise, re-raise, ranges shrink dramatically in limit games. Massively, yeah. And I have not said that because I just haven't really seen too much of that. Like usually there's like 2 bets in there and we don't have to necessarily worry about it. But that concept is super important in limit games. The second thing here is when that starts to happen, right? Like when it goes bet, re-raise, ranges shrink, but also at the same time, polarity, increases dramatically. Like it's usually like they either have it or they don't.
Sure.
So
although it's really rare to see someone 4-bet bluff the turn on some sort of a snow.
Yeah, okay. That's fair too. So I just wanted to bring that up. But if it's just a rare like 4-bet, then yeah, that's fair enough.
And by the way, if he is bluffing, then if you think your opponent's likely to be bluffing or to be very polar, to be bluffing or to have a very good hand, then you should break your 8 and then just call on the river when you make a king anyway.
Yeah, right. That makes total.
You're still going to beat all his bluffs. You don't. It doesn't matter that you have an 8-7.
You're right. Okay. All right. So we'll play the rest of this one out here. Press play. I decide to call. He stands pat. I freeze in position. He bets river. Obviously, like we have an easy call here with the 87 perfect. I think.
Go ahead and value.
Yeah,
right.
sure. Like there's no question here. I bet this hand. And call and
he has some fun bluff. Yeah. I don't know what obviously we'd have to know what his previous street blockers were. I tend to think that his hand is a better give up on the river than to fire the last barrel in this spot. I do expect that most people that have played your line are going to go ahead and call. Like I don't think that it's like, I mean, obviously it's right to have some theoretical bluffs that kind of fire it off, but I don't think his blockers are ideal. I mean, he's kind of unblocking the 9s and 8s and 7s, and like most of those hands are going to cry and call. So.
Yeah, sure. I mean, is his line just, when he has the 2-3-5 and the extra 3 in his hand? I mean, does his hand just make sense to against mine instead of decide to check raise snow, just check raise and call draw 1 with the 10 out of position?
I think he should just check call and draw 1. Yeah, that would be what I would do. People tend to just be a little too tight passive on the turn in this spot and not continue drawing. And like, yeah, you're drawing dead sometimes, but you can't really bluff this spot that much when you have such a big range disadvantage, right? Like, I mean, he just doesn't have a hand that is going to be good enough to do that for value too often, and it gets to be very expensive for him.
Okay, perfect. All right, yeah.
Now, I don't know what his earlier street blockers were. It's possible that he started out with 2 pair as well and has seen like a lot of relevant cards, and that would make the play better and better, right?
Yeah, I mean for sure. Just to show up with like the 3 and the 10, though, like he would. I see what you're saying too, but I also have a deuce and a 3 in my hand. So like the only combination realistically would be like some sort of like 5-5 deuce or something. So I think it's a little bit less likely that that's the case, but yes, you bring up again another good point.
So when you see a hand like this, by the way, it really makes you think back to that previous hand and think, oh gosh, I probably should have called.
Because it was 2 hands ago, and I'm like, oh man, I called the 9-7.
Yeah, whenever you see someone capable of a relatively big bluff like this, that really influences your thoughts on exploitability.
And like what and how they choose to bluff, like with what hands do they choose to bluff with? because
This was plus.
yeah, because if he's choosing a bluff like this, then he's probably just way over bluffing a lot of other spots.
Correct. Although there is something to be said for the idea that like there are some spots where people are more willing to bluff than others, and it's my experience in triple draw that people always find some bluffs when both players are drawing. Like in this spot, it was a 2-1 on the turn. Whereas once somebody's already pat, then people become a little bit more straightforward because they're like, he's not going to fold. He already has a made hand. You know what I mean? So it's interesting that you'll see people that'll take like they'll overbluff some spots and then underbluff other spots.
Okay. Yeah, cool. Agree. All right, let's go to the next one here.
Well, you won that one.
All right, here we have the 9 smooth.
Well, right now we have the 2-3-5, which looks very nice.
I'm gonna let you guess my cards. Here we're under begun again, four-handed, raise, draw 2, make the pass. Yeah. I have to think that I'm not breaking this hand even after the first draw in position here. So, I go ahead and raise first draw. He calls. Like I have to envision like I'm up against some sort of like most likely like 8 draw, maybe a 7 draw, but
Sure.
like I don't think I'm breaking the 9 in this situation.
So one thing I want to say is just like maybe for your audience that's a little bit newer to this game, it is very important to understand how different this hand is from that 9-7-6-4-2 hand that we looked at earlier. I mean, for a number of reasons, right? One reason is because of the multi-way versus heads up thing, where your hand's just stronger heads up. But the other reason is because of the presence of the 2-3-4-5 in this hand. Whenever you have a hand that can make a straight on the river, then you really are more inclined to stand pat than you would be in other situations, because making a straight on the river is the lowest equity situation that you can ever encounter in triple draw. So these kind of hands are kind of what I would call a special class of hands that are a good draw that can end up with a very bad hand. And so you do need to consider that. Like your hand is very clearly a stand pat in my mind, whereas if you made your hand 2-3-4-7-9, it would be a very clear draw on the second draw.
Gotcha.
So that's like a subtle but massive difference in terms of strategy.
Yeah, fair, very fair. Like I always say, the straight draws are always going to count against you. So, or the straights are always going to count against you. So he checks again. I bet he check calls again, and he takes.
Yeah. So this is really nothing going on here, right? Because your hand is easy to play because he hasn't done anything aggressive. I would note that you have a hand that's a little tempting to do some spewy stuff. Like, for example, if he were to check raise on the turn, it's a hand that I would at least consider a 3-bet with. At that point, you're bluffing, you know. But I think that like when you have these smooth hands with like a 9 in them, you're targeting those 8-7s in these tight range spots. So
Sure.
you do get to do some fun messing around with combos like this at times.
Sure. Absolutely. All right. So,
and then I guess you're deciding whether you should value bet the river.
Yeah, well, because this is one of the concepts that we get to here is like one of the concepts we get to here is like, you know, when you go 2 to pat, like it looks snowish, you know.
Sure.
So when situations like that arise, it's like my guess is that we should have some thin value bets. We should adding some thin value bets into our range.
I agree with that. Yeah.
So like I unblock like obviously some of the 7s, some of the 8s here. So
you're going to get check called by bettors sometimes, but I think that it's not that big of a deal, right? Like in a situation like this, you should value cut yourself a little bit of the time. Value cut means you value bet a hand you thought was good, but your opponent just check calls you with a slightly stronger hand. And then the other thing is you don't really need to worry too much that you're ever going to get bluff raised. Your range is very protected here by all your good hands. You don't face a check raise in the spot very often, and that should not be something that is scaring you off from going for a thin value bet. Is the rare check raise that you do have to deal with at times.
Yep. So speaking of that spot right there, we found it. We found the value raise there. So
so I like the play for what it's worth. I do think that this is a spot where, because you stood pat right after the first draw, if he perceives you as a good player, he will want to check to you on the river more often than not. And too often villains will bet the river when they make a really good hand because they really want the bet to go in. But obviously, because you're willing to value bet as a hand as weak as a 9 here, he should probably check most of his range, maybe all of his range. Now I think back to your blockers, and really you had nothing relevant, right? You had ace to start. So you haven't blocked any value. That would definitely lean me a little bit more towards a tight fold. Also, again, just from an exploit argument kind of point of view, I don't think you face a river check raise bluff, very often, if ever. And so, all these things are leaning me more towards making a tight fold. That said, I don't really believe that like a GTO bot would want to fold this spot. I think that you're going to even have some worse hands, and there are those like pair of sevens, pair of eights kind of combos that you're unblocking that sort of makes sense for villain to maybe get a little squirrely with. So, it's very similar to the other hand, which is that in a GTO kind of environment, I think maybe your hand is kind of a crying call, but in a human exploit argument way, I think it would be reasonable to fold this.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, again, like we're always like, especially at these stakes, we're just dealing with humans. And I think the ability to kind of like recognize the situation, like what you're saying is pretty important. It's also, I say a lot, like it's nice to know the solution, whatever like the GTO thing is. But again, you have to realize you're playing against humans who are, not necessarily like exercising that strategy. And I think for what it's worth, I don't get check raised that much here by a bluff. Like
it's an expensive bluff. Your range is quite strong and protected. I would probably in game even give a small consideration to a 3-bet bluff.
Yeah,
but
that's interesting.
Probably, dismiss that pretty quickly since you had no relevant blockers. If you started out with some pairs, maybe I'd be more inclined to go for it.
Fair. Yeah. Well,
one thing I'll just throw out to the audience is this: is that when you're on the river in limit poker, you can know what a GTO bot would do. Like I know limit hold'em really well, right? That's what I've been doing on my channel. And as soon as you face a river bet or a river check raise, literally all your hands that don't beat their value are 0 EV. So you can think all you want about what a solver would do, but all of your hands are basically break even if your opponent plays well. So you can adjust any little factor, and that's going to sway you strongly in one direction or another. So it's not like having some sort of GTO solution here would really help us that much. It's still going to be an annoying spot, and our hand is basically always going to be, break even at best if our opponent is tough, and maybe we're just like lighting money on fire if our opponent isn't tough.
Yeah, right. That makes sense. And then I just said call. I run into
you get often you lose to 8-6, which is kind of a nice play from him. Like I said, I think that I don't think his play's bad at all. I think his play is a nice find, and sometimes people would maybe think his line is a little too thin.
No, yeah. I totally agree with everything you just said. At first, I'm more annoyed that I got check raised by this hand because it's like it was a good play,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he won one extra bet. If he would have led, you would have called.
Yep, for sure. So, all right. That was the fourth one. We got one more to go, Mr. Donkey. Here we go. All right. Rough 9 OOP.
Yeah, well, we have a rough starting at OOP here.
Yes, we do.
But it's enough for me to open raise.
Yep, small blind here. Open from the small blind into the big. Draw 2. And now, this is kind of interesting. I haven't played too much with this person before, but he calls and draws 4. So
cool. I like it. Yep. A man after my own heart.
Yeah, for sure. So we obviously make the 9-5-6 draw. We do have the straight draw, so I don't think there's really anything else to do here except just call and draw 1 at the 9.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting hand in the sense that if your draw was a little nicer underneath the 9, I do think that there's an argument for drawing 2. Like imagine your hand was 2-5-6-9. I think there's a decent argument for drawing 2 facing a raise because you don't really want to draw to a 9 out of position against a range that's claiming extreme strength, right? Like he's probably at minimum drawing 1 and sometimes pat here, and the 9 in your hand is not doing very well against that because that means that he just has like an 8 draw more or an 8 maybe more, and in both those situations the 9 is pretty reverse implied odds heavy here.
Yeah, correct.
But because your 3-5-6 is so ugly, then it does force you out of position to draw more rough. That's like kind of a good concept to remember, is that our rough hands come from our bad draws, which sometimes we don't have too many bad draws, but we have to find them, and this one qualifies, I'd say.
Yeah, I like, he called my hand ugly over there, but that's totally fine. I'll let this one go. All right.
Well, it's fair to analyze your hand, impartially, and then recognize that the caliber of your draw is mediocre, so you might want to just keep this 9 and hope the best.
That's so politically correct. I appreciate it.
All right. Anyway, it goes the 1-1. So Villain is kind of claiming a premium now.
That's
a
the
premium draw.
claiming a premium in this situation. So we make the 9-8 here in this situation, and in the 1-1 now, we were kind of like talking about earlier, in like the 2-2-2 spot when we make the 9-7 out of position here. Now our opponent here has basically said like, I have a strong draw after drawing 4. So when we make this kind of like roughish hand out of position here, do we ever consider like just check call padding? Or do we just like say, no, we made a 9 in a 1-1 spot, we're going to go ahead and bet out of position?
Yeah. Okay, so it's a complicated answer because I do believe in theory that it's not crazy to throw in some check call padding kind of combos. And yours seems like an okay one. I also think there's a better than average chance that Villain might bet the turn unimproved here. Both because he raised in a spot where most people wouldn't raise, so he strikes me as kind of aggressive. And because of your hand, you don't have any 2s or 7s, and often when I'm in position and I pair a 2 or a 7, I'm a little bit more inclined to go for like a semi-bluff raise. So all those things would lead me towards expecting him to bet at a little higher frequency than normal. That said, I think the kind of standard play when you make a mediocre hand out of position in like what's kind of a growing pot is that you just bet because you kind of want to stand pat with your hand. You don't want to give a free card. If it goes check, you had the best hand, but you kind of missed a little bit of value. And yeah, your hand is very clearly a hand that wants to stand pat unless you face more action, and then it becomes kind of a crummy situation no matter what you do, to be honest. So I don't find myself taking the check call pat line in this spot very often at all because it's very hard to balance. It's very hard to figure out what kind of hands fit well into that line. And yeah, it's just kind of a what we call like a low frequency sort of a situation.
Well, I think people in general, when they decide to, even good players, I wouldn't say the best players, but even some good players, it's like, okay, I'm going to decide to take the check call pat line in this situation. And I would say more often than not, like a 10 falls into that category, but it's usually like, I would say like a 10, and there's not too much else in that situation. And I don't know what a good, like a balancing, I would say like balancing act even looks like. It just says like, I'm going to realize my equity with a 10, what else would I have here kind of thing.
Right. I will say it's not inherently bad to be in a situation where you can never have a very good hand, right? It's not like a disaster to check call pat and then never have a wheel, right? Like some people think, well, I need to balance by slow playing sometimes. Like that's not how a solver would think, and that's not how like a good player should think. Like there's plenty of situations where you just need to protect your equity and just turn your hand face up as like mediocre and say, beat it and take it. Like the pot's big. All you can really do is face me with one more bet. There's like nothing you can do that'll make my life that difficult. And I just need to know what my own range looks like and just not fold the river too often.
Okay, cool.
All right. That said, I prefer betting this hand, especially with the pair blocker you saw earlier.
Sure. So I do bet. He calls.
Okay, so all things are good. By the way, what would you have done if he raised?
I mean, the fact that I probably would have called, and if he padded behind, I probably would have just check folded the river. But
sure,
when people, I feel like when people start to get, for lack of a better term, a little bit spewy in those spots, they try to get you to break, they try to get you to like make mistakes out of position like that. They're overdoing it, and like I think a lot of people too is like, I have a strong draw, I'm just gonna keep raising him and just try to like get him to do something here. I've seen that so much, especially at low stakes in my career, that sure. I just like, I think the exploitative play would just be to pat my hand, and if he pats behind, just check fold.
Right, because now he's saying two things when he does that, right? One, the raise on the turn could be a semi-bluff, but when he pats behind, he's really, one thing you could think about that might help a lot in this situation is think about how expensive of a bluff it is for him to raise the turn, stand pat behind you, and then bet the river. He's risking 3 big bets, plus he's risking all of the equity of whatever his draw was by not continuing to draw. This is why it's like a complete disaster if your opponent has a hand like 2, 3, 4, 7, 7 in this spot and ends up padding with it. I've seen this play from like well-meaning players, and it is an abject disaster to put in so many big bets and not get to draw out your wheel. So just maybe you can, maybe viewers can think about that from both sides, that it's like, that's the sort of thing you never want to be doing.
Yeah, I've seen that too, and thinking to myself, well, I've seen it in Medugi too. I've seen like people turn like ace deuce threes into bluffs.
Sure, yeah. But it's even worse in triple draw because your wheel draw has so much equity.
Yeah.
I guess the only other thing I was asking was that did you have any consideration to breaking your hand to draw at the 8-6-5-3? Because you've improved your draw substantially from the 9 draw to the 8-6 draw now.
That's an interesting point, but they're definitely not the same draw. But having the 8-6-5-3 here against a raise, like against what I perceive is his raising range after the first draw, like I almost feel like I'm not going to say they're the same hand, but they feel like the same hand. Because
because I mean there is that subcategory of hands that he can have that even if he has a wheel draw, but he makes that 8-7, like he makes that annoying 8-7, that does happen a decent clip. But I hear you. I think that your draw isn't so strong that I would want to break the hand to a raise. Because again, if, as you said, if he's ever semi-bluffing, if he's an aggressive player, breaking the winning hand here, and this pot is getting bigger because it was raised pre-flop and it was raised on the flop. So this pot is not as small as one we looked at earlier in some ways. Yeah. So I'm with you. I like the plan to pat here. And now obviously you have to check the river. And this guy is aggressive, and you haven't seen any relevant cards of like the 2s or the 7 for either like the key cards in this game. So I'm paying off the river with this combo.
That's fair. That seems totally fair. Now, there is one question I want to ask specifically, to kind of close out, is at what point do you consider, like if the pot's big enough, at what point do you consider value betting your hand to try to get paid off? Is there like there's like a size of the pot where you're just like, the pot's so big, he probably just like to call me with like decent frequency here.
I hear you. I think it has more to do with the way the hand progressed to the river in some ways. You would like it to be a situation where your range can be stronger and his range could be weaker. So he's what we call very polarized in his draw here by the way he played the hand and by the blockers that you've seen. It's extremely likely that he's drawing to a premium low, or he's more or less going to miss on the river, right? So against that, you don't have as much incentive to bet into that range. Whereas if you imagine your hand was somewhat different, imagine you start out with a pair of 2s with a 7 and you end up catching an 8 and then a 9. Now your hand is, maybe even slightly weaker, but you've seen more relevant cards. And if your opponent never took an aggressive action, he's drawing to much rougher hands in general. And it might be more possible that you have bluffs in your line. So I think that it's a nuanced question, but it has a lot more to do with the way you arrive at the river than it has to do with the exact makeup of the exact cards that you have and the exact pot size. Because you can get to the river in this pot size through a lot of different ways.
Okay. Yeah.
Does that answer your question? I know it's not really a satisfying answer, but my answer is that this is a very clear check for me.
Yeah. I totally agree. Like this spot is a very clear check. The one thing I think about frequently is like, and maybe this is more of an exploit of like certain opponents that I've played against in the past, is like, the bigger the pot gets, they're just more likely to just pay off to try to find my bluff. They're like,
Sure.
Oh, he could be bluffing here. He's capable. Might as well do it. And
so I would just say what you're describing is a nice exploit. What you're describing is the idea that like the money kind of goes in better for you if you just bet. Like if you're going to pay off a bet, like the conventional wisdom might be like, well, you should just bet yourself. But here's the thing. One, your hand is so bad that you might lose in a check situation and still be happy you saved the bet. Like if he makes the 9-7 on the river, he just checks down and you lose, but you lose one bet less. And then 2, I'd be really, really scared that you get raised on the river and you're not sure what to do, having not seen any 2s and not seen any 7s.
that's also a very fair point. Yeah.
Like this is the sort of hand that I'd be a little paranoid if I got raised on the river and think, oh my God, what if my opponent's seen all 4 deuces?
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, he easily could have started with like deuce, drawn 4, caught another deuce raised, and then on the river he catches 4 deuces and decided, all right.
Right? You know what I mean? I don't really, that exploit that you're describing works really well when your opponents play very straightforward and passive. It doesn't work so well if your opponents are aggressive.
Okay, that's fair. That's I think that's a really good summation right there. So yeah.
Cool.
Yep. So here, I hovered there for a second. Was not going to check, but
he had a weaker draw than you'd think.
Yeah, I was pretty surprised to see the 87, but my guess is he just thought I was had a weak draw. So, all right.
Yeah. I mean, people just can be a little spewy when they're not super experienced with this game. I mean, even in a blind battle, I think the ranges do shrivel up kind of quickly in those raised spots post flop. But obviously, by him drawing 4 initially, he's already showing that he's kind of a loose aggressive player. I think his play's fine. But I'm just saying that like you don't always see that from players. So
in all fairness, too, he might have seen 3 deuces too, something like that.
Yeah, that's a good point, right?
Where like he started with 2 deuces and then caught the deuce, and then it's like, oh, I'm just gonna go for it here, like gonna get my value. And
There's a lot of ways you can look at a hand and analyze it, and one thing you could say about this is that you're a little lucky he didn't decide to raise the turn, because when he does have an 8-7 draw with good blockers, it is a tempting hand to turn into a bluff. If he had caught like another 8 on the turn, for example, like it might have been a nice play to go for a bluff raise and barrel instead of draw.
Yeah. All right. Good points. Well, we got through 5 today.
All right, triple draw.
No,
a lot of interesting games in this round, yeah.
Yeah, well, I try to pick the interesting ones. I'm feel like if I'm gonna get you on a call, it's you know, it's like I said, it's part of the. I want to analyze.
I'm happy to
here.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it. I'm happy that you're making this content. I mean, obviously, the small stakes games on Phenom Poker are a great learning resource for people that are trying to practice the mixed games, and your videos explaining like the basics of all these games are really helpful. Hopefully I've been able to add some ideas. And obviously, if someone wants to get in contact with me for my own take on things, I do one-on-one coaching. I have my own channel at DeathDonkey where I'm doing some solver analysis for mixed game hands. And
yeah, I mean, I'll put that all in the comments too. So if anyone's looking for info on Chris, yeah, feel free. And in the future, I think we're gonna kind of do these occasionally, and yeah, man, I'm so happy you were able to jump on a call with me and go over this stuff, and hope to hear your voice here going forward here, either in either Poker Go Studio or at the World Series again. So, yeah, man, thank you. Keep running to you. Thanks for joining me, and I will. All right, guys, as always, thank you much. Talk to you soon. Play well at the tables. Bye bye.